has been he has been he has been an academic for around a decade, mentoring students of popular schools of architecture. He is an active heritage enthusiast. His contributions have earned him the coveted Vedavalli Memorial Award for outstanding service by a young achiever in the field of South Indian heritage. He is well versed in the fields of art, architecture, heritage, cultural studies, and vernacular practices. He is also a popular speaker on a wide range of topics associated with heritage, religion, and literature. He has been the recent recipient of the title Ilakkiya Chemmal, recognizing his mastery over Tamil literature. He curates and conducts tours to places of architectural and cultural interests. Today's session is an interactive session and it is a follow-up session for yesterday. So please type your questions in the chat box and it will be moderated at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Welcome, Professor Madhusudhanan. On to you.
விண்ணாடும் தேவர்க்கும் மேலாய வேதியனை மண்ணாடும் மன்னவர்க்கும் மாண்பாகி நின்றானை தன்னார் தமிழளிக்கும் தன்பாண்டி நாட்டானை பெண்ணாடும் பாகனை பேணு பெருந்துறையில் கண்ணார் கடல் காட்டி நாயேனை ஆட்கொண்ட அண்ணாமலையானை பாடுதுங்கான் அம்மானாய் சித்தம் தெளிவீர்கள் அத்தன் ஆரூரை பத்தி மலர்த்தூவ முக்தியாகுமே. Very good evening to you all. It gives me immense pleasure to address the gathering of patrons of the Hindu Society of Hindu Temple of Bloomington as a part of their annual festival, the Varshikotsavam. The two-part series that this was planned to be aimed at understanding, helping our audience understand how temples have functioned as spaces much more than just religious that they are. So yesterday's session was on the multi-centric approach with which the temple was conceived and the kind of verticals that it's multi-use space that it could be adapted to, same space serving as the venue for various different activities and more. Since when has these temples interacted this way with the society? Sure, there are questions like, when exactly did this start? How long had it taken for it to evolve this level? It's not quite possible for somebody on day one to say, let's have a structure like this, to which all of us would be associated in these many different ways. So this is how the structure is going to interact with us. The space is going to interact with us at this level. That's not possible, right? So it's more an evolution process. And understanding from where it started helps us chart out a growth plan for the future. So today's session is going to be on the evolution of temple architecture, cutting across the globe, cutting across the timelines. So we'll be concentrating for like 90% of the lecture on Indian temples. And the last 5 or 6 slides, I've just handpicked a few Hindu temples, Indian temples, that which I have visited in the USA during my very there a decade back, and analyzing how these temples have evolved over times and the purpose that they serve, whichever part of the world that they belong to. And it's like an extension from yesterday's session. So a timeline, that's a part of the title. So tracing the origin of any movement is extremely important. A progress chart can be better drafted with a clear understanding of from where we started, the mistakes that we've done, because it's after all a trial and error method. Architecture as a branch of science also has evolved over trial and error method. We see temples from the early past, ancient past in fact, where you have larger than what was required. It was a time that they were experimenting with materials like stone, not quite clear about the load that it can take, the purpose that it can serve. They've just gone in for something much more than what it took several centuries for them to understand the science behind the material and the load distribution pattern. Stone as a material, what's the kind of load that it can withstand, the various different forces that acts on it, and all this took its own time for our architects to understand. But once they understood, there was no limit to their creativity. They've tried their best in all possible materials and come up with really interesting and puzzling structures. By puzzling,
Madhusudhanji, sorry to disturb
engineering
you, but
principles that they have conceived.
we need to adjust your camera, please.
1 second. Is it fine now?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. By engineering puzzles, I mean the way they have conceived the load distribution system in come up with. So these are areas who it would definitely go a big way in helping us draft a more successful model that accommodates the changes that happens with time. The need for documentation. Now that's another major question, at least in countries like India. It's only in the last 1 decade we've thought the importance of documentation as a scientific process. The very need for documenting the happenings, documenting the structures, filing and creating records of findings, that's something very important. And only this helps us preserve and hand over heritage to the coming generations. So documentation as a very important aspect of formulating a timeline is something that we all need to learn a little about. So in order to draft a timeline, we document these structures, analyze them, put them on literally a timeline with zero in the center and with common era happening to your right and what happened before the common era to your left. Putting them in the right place helps us understand the growth pattern too. So with that little understanding as to why we learn a timeline, why we understand a timeline, let's get started on what looks like a little more than a 2,000-year-old journey. So it's going to be a roller coaster ride. I'm just covering as many regions in India as possible, which offers a unique style of temple architecture. I'm not being very strict with numbers here, as in the centuries and years. It's not something that I'm really concentrating much on. So I'll probably just take it like after this happened, and after this, that happened. Probably give a couple of milestone years or centuries alone wherever required. Please don't worry about remembering the dates or numbers per se. So let's get started. We are all used to massive temple structures like Bharakadish temple at Bharaka, or the stunning Khajuraho group of monuments, or the big temple at Tanjavur, or something as complicated as Madurai Meenakshi or Srirangam. But where did all this begin? A massive complex with multiple concentric corridors that have tens of shrines, sub-shrines, spaces that facilitates the activities there cannot happen overnight. A master plan for a complex as huge as that, wherein the residential complexes for the employees of the temple and for other people who are associated with the temple is also a part of the master plan. This cannot happen overnight. So at some point, it should have started, it should have had a very humble beginning. So that's where our story also starts. So we have the concept of worship. Once faith develops into worship, practices get seasoned into rituals, code of conduct, and all that comes into place. Again, that's exactly where the evolution begins. It by itself is an evolutionary process. So we can only trace as old as the Vedic period, wherein we have very simple references to residences of gods. So the very concept of coming up with a structural shelter to house your gods happens in the Vedas. There are references to grand mansions of Indra with thousands of windows around it. One can be really sure that a structure with 1,000 windows wasn't probably constructed per se. itself is a starting point. And then you have several references of altar spaces in the Karmaganda of our Vedic texts. That part of the way, fire ritual, so traditions that way. So how do you do it? How are these performed? What do we use? What is offered? When we talk about all that, we have altar spaces that are discussed. Different shapes for the offerings to be made, the platforms to be constructed, the kind of mandalas or combination of geometric shapes that you draw on them, the kind of colors that you fill these mandalas up with, the geometric patterns, and what each of it signifies, balance, shapes, symmetry, all those artistic elements that goes into creating the mandalas. The mandalas by themselves are again residences for these gods. So we start from there. Much later, around the Gupta period, we start getting simple clay tablets, which kind of portrays those simple residences of gods, which were nothing but a raised platform on which an altar was designed with the murti installed in the center. The picture of the altar that you see in the top right corner of the slide is again from the Mathura, wherein right in the center you see what looks like a Shivalinga installed on a platform, and there is a tree under which this altar has been with very thick foliage. There's a small platform, and the platform is very clear. Shivaganas who've come there to offer a garland to that murti there. And then you also have coins from the ancient past, which again depicts these kind of very simple altar spaces. The picture just below it, the slide there, has another Mukhalinga. So the cylinder Shivalingam can be seen, that's kept on a platform which is built out of bricks. You can see the bricks there. Yeah, so the platform is built out of bricks, and there's a tree there again. And the Shivalinga has a face that just pops out of it, and that's what is called as a Mukhalinga, an Eka Mukhalinga. So that by itself is a simple altar. I'm sure people who visited the villages in India can recall a plaza or a center in the village square, which also has a simple structure like this with one murti, say a Ganesha or a Shivalinga or a Krishna installed there, or some cases the rural deities themselves, like the snake gods, installed there under a tree, under a tree. So that's exactly where the story started. Then, once they started looking out for more permanent structures, the concept of natural caves and creating caves or making spaces between boulders should have started. And that's where you have the beautifully done cave temples. I've just shown a few popular examples. The one to your left bottom is the very popular and the most ancient Lomas Rishi cave in Barabar, Madhya Pradesh. One of the most ancient and elaborate cave dwelling ever constructed. And then you have the Udaygiri and the Kandagiri caves in Odisha, which are the pictures to your right. Much later, after the cave temples, we have the concept of monolith, where a huge boulder is completely shipped off and designed to form a temple all by itself. The grand temple complex of Kailasanatha at Ellora is a classic example for a monolith. Then you have structural temples. That's when more finer tools that could work with hard granite was designed, and huge boulders were cut into stone, and they were placed one on top of the other to come up with structural temples. I have this very, very interesting inscription from a cave temple in a very small village in Tamil Nadu, which I'm sure 95% of the population of Tamil Nadu is not aware of, is this picture, this cave, in a village called Mandagappattu near Thiruvannamalai, a very popular religious center of worship. So this is very close to that temple town. And this cave temple has a very interesting inscription on the front that this cave was excavated by this king called Vichitra Chitta, the one whose interests were very different and unique. Vichitra Chitta. His thoughts were very unique. He says, I, Vichitra Chitta, commissioned this temple with 3 shrines, one each for the Trimurti gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Rudra. More interestingly, he adds on to say that this is the first attempt where a residence for the Trimurtis have been commissioned without using timber, lime, metal, or bricks. All these 4 materials that have been quite extensively used from the Vedic period had just one deficiency in them, that they were perishable, that they were temporary, that they could withstand the test of time. So he says, I've just come up with this idea to go for a structure which is quite permanent, sans bricks, metal, timber, or lime plaster. That's a very, very important inscription that we get from around the 7th century, which speaks about the first man-made cave. Arguably, this is not exactly the first ever done cave temple. Probably the king who was ruling from here, Mahendravarma Pallava, an illustrious Pallava king, thought that he was the first one to attempt it, and he's just gone on to take the credits. This is a milestone inscription from the 7th century. These are 2 classic examples of monoliths. The one to your left is in another very small village called a monolith excavated by Mahendravarma Pallava, and to your right is the 8th century Vettuvan Koil, a small village near Tirunelveli, south of Tamil Nadu again, where a huge hill has been quarried to come up with a temple. This is the Kailasanatha equivalent of the south. Sure, you should all be aware of the Kailasanatha temple, the grand temple complex, a monolith again from Ellora campus. This is more like a South Indian version of it from the 7th, 8th century again. So these are monoliths. So let's get started with the very popular group of caves, Ajanta and Ellora. Ajanta, of course, is completely Buddhist, and Ellora is a combination of Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu temples. So that's how a cave is excavated. So it's a huge boulder where they've started burrowing from the face of it. Gram by gram, the granite has got to be chipped off with handheld tools for how many ever decades it took to go in and quarry, create space there, and that is further chipped off to create circumambulatory paths, cells, shrines, murtis, and whatnot. Ajanta and Ellora stands apart for a simple reason that it is constructed by human beings. There's no doubt about it. Please don't go by amateur versions which speaks about a possible alien connect to these wonders. These are man-made wonders. Let's just humbly accept it, bow before it, and keep moving. There is no proof for any kind of alien connect and other such stories to these beautiful man-made wonders. So these are the Chaitya halls, and we're just going to Ellora, where you have one of the most challenging structure ever done. Before the structure happened here, the structure was just a plain hillock, a rough, tough hill, wherein master plan from the top of it has been drafted. I mean, it's much more than just brilliance. It's much more than just being very precise in your blueprint drafting. I'm sure most of you would have very interesting stories that you've heard from your engineers or architect friends about how a bad planning can screw up major projects and prove out to be fatal in some cases. Not sure who is this genius who came up with blueprint for a structure like this, where you have to quarry in at the same time. You should not quarry places where you're going to have a part of the temple structure as such. it's in fact much easier to quarry from the front face, front elevation and go in deep than to quarry from the top and go down. That's just too much for sheer intelligence or brilliance for a human mind, and that's exactly why we should pay back to these unknown artisans by at least making a visit once in your lifetime to see these and just feel very humble. Some of these, I mean, I was not really, sharing pictures of the murtis there was not in my cards initially, but how can I pass off without, at least talking about a couple of these beautiful murtis. That's Shiva's wedding, Shiva as Kalyana Sundara, and taking in hand Parvati in his wedlock, and there is Brahma who's conducting the rituals. There is Vishnu and Lakshmi to your left, and they're just overseeing the wedding of their beloved sister, and the celestials have all assembled there for the wedding. More temples. So what started from simple caves where they have managed to burrow in and create structures, for the first time you see a platform raised outside the temple that houses a Nandi or a Rishabha to be more clear. That's the bull, the Vahana of Shiva, and this is one of those early occurrences where the Vahana of the deity enshrined inside is parked outside. The first time, a space for the Vahana has been created and the Nandi is installed on top of it. We're just moving on to simple early period structures. This is from the Gupta period, what's called as in a place called Diogar, where a shrine for the Dashavatara form of Vishnu has been constructed. Now, these are those really early times when structural temples have just started coming up. But even before that, again from the same period, you have from the 5th century, early 5th century, you have a temple in Madhya Pradesh, in a place, in Pigava, that's a very small village. Arguably, this is the first ever structural temple built which stands intact till date. So you can notice it's a simple square plan. The Sanctum Sanctorum is a very simple square plan with a square-shaped antechamber which has 2 columns to take the load. Now, for the frontage of this structure, you actually those 2 columns in the center. The stone slab can very conveniently rest on the slabs in the extreme alone, but not being really sure what would be the kind of load transfer that's possible here, just in case, not to take risk, they've gone in for 2 added columns. So this is where it started, the trial and error that I was telling you. So this is a shrine for Vishnu as Vasudeva, and this little village has several more shrines built from the same time. Quickly, we are traveling down south to the east coast, the Coromandel coast, where you have another group of UNESCO World Monuments in the twin towns Koram and Kanchipuram, 2 extremely poetic cities that have been active since the Sangam period, much before than much earlier to the Common Era, where you have these 2 very cosmetic looking structures in the shore temples, as they are called, 2 shrines dedicated to Shiva, and in the center is a small rectangular shrine dedicated to Vishnu. So there are Shiva and one for Vishnu in this poetry in stone. From the same period is this jewel of Pallava art, temple dedicated to Shiva as Kailasanatha in Kanchipuram. These are early structural temples. As the Pallavas were built, see here, beautifying places like Badami, Aihole, and Patadakal, the Chalukyan triplet as they are. So you have these 3 settlements that are busy even much before the Chalukyas came into picture. But it was during their time, the contemporaries of Pallavas, it was during their time, some of these finest structural temples were built. So the campus there, this is another UNESCO World Heritage Monument, but the campus there has several temples, each of it in a different form. The one that you see in the picture, the structure to the left is in an apsidal form. So the Sanctum Sanctorum is actually in a semicircular plan and a rectangle projection. So the space where people stand to have a darshan of Devi, that's a temple dedicated to Durga. So the place where people gather to have a darshan of Devi, it's rectangular shape, and the sanctum sanctorum is semicircular. That's how it looks. The grand front courtyard, I mean, it's just filled with sculptures. These are all from Badami, Patadakal, and Ayodhya. This is a popular temple dedicated to Shiva with a circumambulatory path and a space to climb up on top. So that's probably one of those early shikaras or vimanas that were designed. Patadakal, here you can see how a simple pyramidal vimana has been constructed, and on top of it stands a kalasha. So by now we've started doing several structural temples. More from the Chalukyan triplet. A square-shaped temple. You have, a platform in the front, and you climb up. The door jamb and ventilators, the pilasters, everything is made out of stone. Patadakal group of temples. As you can notice, this is more like an experimentation. It's a lab where different combinations, shapes, void and mass, balance, and all that has. Patadakal group of temples. So, here as such, you can see the evolution. The sanctum sanctorum is there. You have the vimana on top of it. Then you have a circumambulatory path, the Pradakshina Patha. And as you come around, you have multiple small shrines to other gods associated with the prime deity in the temple. That includes Ganesha, Devi, Kartikeya, Surya, and the others.
I'm going to give you 4 fill in the
The
blank.
very romantic landscape of Badami.
All of them in 60 seconds or less.
The central courtyard, the ornamentation that has been done. They tried out different load distribution patterns from square and huge ones to circular columns, and the size of the columns varies in each of the structures. So all of this just means that they're on an experimentation mode. They're on a trial and they're on a phase of trial and error findings. That's Shiva's dance, Chatur, Ganesha, Subramanya, and others. Very closely, Chalukyas, a couple of centuries after the Chalukyas, we have the rise of the Hoysalas around the 12th, 11th to 13th century, and they were quite active till the Muslim invasion from the north that happened in the 14th century. In fact, if there were reasons that some of the structures were protected, we owe it to the Hoysalas. Unfortunately, the lesser known dynasty and the lesser spoken also. So here you have the Hoysala structures. These are, of course, Velur, Halibad, Somnathpur in Karnataka, but the Hoysalas have also contributed to several important temples in Tamil Nadu. So these are some of the jewels designed by the Hoysalas. So you have a central courtyard branching out into sub-shrines in 3 possible directions. So as you can see in this picture, you have the entrance archway guarded by a pair of elephants. You walk into a space that looks like a darbar hall. So that's the central courtyard. And from the central platform, you have access to your left, to your right, and just in front of you. So there are 3 shrines dedicated to 3 different gods. Constructing shrines with intricate design patterns placed on a high-rise platform is what the Hoysalas have been doing for some time. These are hand-sculpted murtis, no aliens, no such stories. Hand-sculpted, and you still thankfully have artisans who makes similar looking structures. A little before the Hoysalas, the Karnataka land was occupied by the mighty Cholas, and the Cholas were ruling from Tanjavur. And I'm sure I needn't introduce this edifice to anybody in audience. The grand dream of Rajaraja that came true. to construct a shrine befitting the greatness of Shiva. So if there's that befits him as the all-pervading and the omnipotent and omnipresent God, it needs a big temple in Tanjavur. That's how grand the shrine is. I'm not getting into explaining the nuances, but when it comes to the big temple in Tanjavur, for unknown reasons, once again, you have all these enthusiasts who prefer elaborating myths and tales about the structure. If there is anything that goes against science, you can be sure that it is a myth. Popular stories and accounts about how this Vimana or the superstructure does not cast a shadow is a big fat lie. It casts a shadow as much as any other structure does. It falls on the ground, not that it falls on itself, it falls on the ground. It does not defies any element of sciography. Yeah, so that's there. And the hemispherical dome on top is made out of multiple stones. It's not a single stone, 88-ton or 80-ton stone that was rolled on top on an inclined plane that ran for 3 kilometers. That's another big fat lie, which was documented by none less than the British Broadcasting Corporation. And it is still on YouTube. We've written multiple letters to correct them, but they've not taken any action. That aside, I've personally verified going on top of it several times. It's not a monolith stone. It's not a single stone. It's made of multiple blocks that have been put together. And that's the big temple, a temple built on 2 stories. So, I mean, it just looks beautiful, grand in any part of the day, any part of the year, from any angle that you photograph. The Gangaikonda Cholapuram, a continuation of the big temple, commissioned by the illustrious son of Rajaraja Chola. That's Gangaikonda Cholapuram. Quickly, we are traveling to Srirangam, a temple town as such. This is the largest functioning or living Hindu temple in the world. The temple and the temple town are put together. In fact, they are together. The temple is made out of 7 concentric rectangles. The last 2 are where the residential quarters are. You just do a Google map search, you can see the 7 concentric rectangles quite clearly, and how the last 2 rectangles are completely residential quarters, and the remaining 5 are part of the temple complex. Almost every dynasty that ruled the south of India has contributed in one. That's a grand gold cladded Sriranga, under which Mahavishnu as Ranganatha is on his reclining pose. The grand tallest Gopuram in South Asia. More Gopurams. You have close to 21 Gopurams, each of varying size. The Swarga Dwara, or the Vaikunta Dwaram as it is called, which is opened on the Vaikunta Ekadasi day. Grand mandapas, different sizes, different periods. I'm just introducing Srirangam in the most simple way possible. Madurai, as it is seen, is now mostly from the 16th century. Unfortunately, this ancient temple town was, it was just ransacked and looted and plundered during the invasion of the 14th century, the Islamic invasion of the 14th and the Nayak kings. So another great example for temple being an identity to the complete settlement. That's the city of Madurai. We're traveling to the east, Odisha, another state which can be rightly called as the cradle of Indian civilization, traditions and faith systems that are extremely strong and active till date, as much as it is in the South Indian states. So it's pretty strong there. And the style of architecture that they have is very unique and a trademark for that for the region there. The Kalinga school and the Gangas, who 2 mighty dynasties that have ruled there, have been great patrons of art and architecture. So they've come up with some of the finest structures ever built. The characteristic cylindrical tall shikara on top of the Sanctum Sanctorum and several pyramidal octagonal or pyramidal roof, octagonal shaped or a four-sided or a six-sided hall in front of the Sanctum Sanctorum, and the hierarchy of shapes that they follow, and all of it put together, it's a different language all by itself. What's followed in Orissa is a different language all by itself. More shrines. So you can see how the central shrine dedicated to Shiva gets multiplied into smaller shrines, which are all similar in shape. That's complex of Jagannatha, the god of this region, in fact. More from Jagannatha's shrine. So you have what is called as a Bhoga Mandapa or that Mandapa or cloistered hall where you have the food offerings made. You have a Ranga Mandapa, which is where performances are happen, where performances happen, music, dance, and theater, oration, all of it happens as a part of the ritual to the god. The Sun Temple at Konark, unfortunately, where the Sanctum Sanctorum has collapsed, all that we have today is probably the Bhoga Mandapa. That's where people gather around to have a darshan of the god, and from where the services to the deity are performed. And the world famous chariot shaped structure that it is, with huge wheels and horses to pull the chariot. One grand temple complex dedicated to the sun god. It has so much of philosophy behind it, the architectural wonder that it is. It's just philosophy encapsulated into architecture. That's the Nritta Mandapa where dance performances were conducted. Thankfully, the tourism department is hosting the annual festivals where traditional dance and music performances are conducted as such. It's in the same state of Odisha. You have these circular temples dedicated to Devi as Yogini. So that's the circular temple complex with them shrines dedicated to the Yoginis, or a loose translation for the Yoginis. They are the nymphs, the virgin women that they are all. They are 64 in number, and they attend to the calls and command of Lalita Parameshwari. There are shrines dedicated to them, and all these shrines are built in a circular plan. The center altar space with a shrine for Shiva. You're going to the west of India, where again you have another grand temple dedicated to the sun god in a city called Modera, in a village in fact called Modera, another UNESCO World Heritage Monument. This is to the west. Quite surprisingly, you have one sun temple dedicated in the eastern corner on the east coast of the country, one to the west and one to the north and one to the grand temple complex for Marthanda Surya in Kashmir. And in west, you have Modera, which you're just seeing in Gujarat. East, you have the Sun Temple in Konark, and to the south, in Tamil Nadu, you have a temple dedicated to Surya near Kumbakonam. So, quite interestingly, in all four cardinal directions, you have 4 major temples dedicated to the sun god. That's the front in Modera. The grand canopy or the rooftop, that's a ceiling design, in fact. And it's worth all breaking your neck to appreciate them, to bend over and take a look and appreciate them. The grand temple constructed in the last, completed in the last 1 century. Dwarkanath temple, Somnath temple for Shiva, one of the Jyotirlingas, and completed post-independence. We're going further to the east extreme of the country, West Bengal and the northeastern states, where it rains quite, the rains are quite torrential. So the roof pattern. Secondly, availability of granite or sandstone is minimum. So they've gone for beautiful, delicate structures out of brick. So they are all designed and built out of bricks. So please ensure that if you're making a trip to West Bengal or any of the northeastern states, the brick temples are to be there. I mean, it's a mandate kind if you're visiting West Bengal. There you can see the brick, on which you have lime plaster, and the roof is a very simple conical roof. They were there was this tradition of constructing residences out of bamboo. Bamboo is quite, I mean, it's available in abundance there. So they've gone for bamboo construction wherever possible. So this structure built out of bricks, they've just tried to mimic the form that it would have looked if it were constructed in bamboo with thatched roof. More brick structures. I mean, the elaborate design patterns, ornamentation, using different molds to craft those bricks with the design and emblem on it. They're there just everywhere around West Bengal. We are into the golden era of Indian civilization, what can be called as the golden era. The Hampi city, the city which was called as Vijayanagara, the city of victory, commissioned by Harihara and Bukkaraya, two great names that every Indian should remember, who fought against the tyranny of invasion and ensured that dharmic practices are re-established. This is more than just a city, though unfortunately it's all in ruins today. Major parts of it is in ruins today. This is much more than just a city, and the pinnacle of South Indian art in the recent past. If we talk about that school of art and architecture in the last half a millennium, it's undoubtedly the Vijayanagara school, which has contributed to functioning of these temples in the most efficient manner. The reason why I chose the Virupaksha temple, or the only functioning temple of Hampi, as the title cover picture for both the days, is that a visit to Virupaksha temple, after knowing the history of Hampi and how it has survived all these years, would certainly make one extremely emotional. Whichever part of India you belong to, irrespective of that, if ever you think that you should get your little kids at home, help them get in touch with the roots, irrespective of whichever region of India you belong, Hampi is there in. It's a common point for all of us to go back, visit, hire a guide, listen to the stories, or do a good nice reading before you go there, relive what you've read there, or read those appropriate passages, sitting in those monuments, to know about the golden era as it was, to know about how many months these structures were burning, to ensure. I mean, we have records of how palm trees were cut and coconut trees were cut. They were erected around these gopurams and then set on fire. For the heat, it took close to 2 months for it to, for 2 long months they kept fueling it to ensure that they burnt down. That's how strong faith and emotion and culture has been. And the Virupaksha's shrine, which is much more older. I mean, traditionally speaking, it's recorded that Rama himself has visited the shrine. That's more like the traditional past. But they have been there several centuries, even before Harihara and Bukkaraya came to this spot. Thankfully, thousands of people have given their life to ensure that the daily rituals for Virupaksha happens till date. If there is one temple that sign, an emblem of the continuous growth of Indian civilization, it's the shrine at Hampi. If you ever wondered why I use the same temple picture for 2 days presentation for both my lectures, it's this reason. Every visit there makes me go quite emotional to see the services that happen there on a daily basis. No wonder, though the complete city is in ruins, there is just one street of priests who live there, make a very, very meager income from pilgrims and people who come there to perform final rites and other things. There is just one street of priests who live there to ensure at least this little part of what was once upon a time an active city is still alive today. Else, all other structures are monuments. They were not designed to be monuments. Unfortunately, the norms that we have chosen, archaeological norms that we have chosen, does not permit reinstatement of rituals or murtis in these temples again. So there is this one temple where the rituals are still conducted. Nothing like hearing to Rudram being chanted there during all 6 core services in the temple, or the music or that comes from the Nagaswaram that's played during the rituals or others. I mean, Virupaksha's temple is emotion to me. So the other shrines are all in Hampi. This is Balagopala's shrine. What should have been a very poetic temple with, just imagine Devasis performing there during the festivals, and the grand market street in front of the temple that runs close to 1 kilometer long, active with tradesmen, all sorts of goods being sold, and the procession happening in the center. Should have been one. The step well of Hampi, which was recently excavated in a couple of decades back. Jain temples, a few Jain temples are also there in Hampi. We are coming down south to Kerala, another very poetic state, God's own country as it is called, where you have the Dravidian school of architecture that is followed, but again, to ensure that the structures are not disturbed by the torrential monsoon that happens close to 70 or 80% of a calendar year, they've gone in for sloped roof being a part of the construction. So if you notice here, this is the popular Gopuram entrance style of Kerala. The Gopuram structure, the lower part of it is pretty much similar to the Gopurams that you see in Tamil Nadu, but instead of a tall superstructure, they've gone in for sloped tiled roof structure to ensure that water does not percolate inside the structure or stagnates there, and to ensure an efficient rainwater drainage system, they've gone in for a sloped roof structure. So similarly, the interiors, the Sanctum Sanctorum also has structures made out of stone, and then there is extensive usage of timber and tiled roofs. It's very poetic all by itself. So they've gone in for very precise and good-looking laying of tiles, which adds on beauty. Then you have windows and louvers made out of timber. So there is maximum ventilation and minimum water percolation. Central India, another grand story. So the Bhojpuri style of temple construction, the Khajuraho group of monuments. Thanks to whoever this British hunter was, upon these temples which were forgotten for good, and he just noticed the tall shikara once upon a time and brought it back to life. And let me tell you, Khajuraho is much more than just the erotic sculptures that you see there. It's a part of it, and again, extremely unfortunate that Khajuraho is just known for these sculptures of love and lovemaking. There is much more to the group of monuments, the temples there. I mean, each of the temple is a sculptural wonder by itself. I mean, look at the Shivalingam there. That's handcrafted, exclusively made to be accommodated in this shrine, and the arched entrance way, which is 5 times taller than the structure, and you have the door jambs guarded by Ganga and Yamuna on either sides. That's the grand temple for Mahadeva in Bhojpur. The scale of the Shivalingam is just unimaginably huge. So as time passed, with invasions and people from other culture visiting it, active trade happening, we had several aspects of external influence that came in. Architecture from Persia, architecture from other parts of the Western world, and after some time, even the Victorian influence made its way, and the local artisans were also inspired / influenced by these schools of architecture. And you can see how the mud arch, which is very particular, roof that you see in Victorian churches, all of these got imbibed into temple planning also. So the Byzantine style of dome construction, the multicast Islamic arch, even the palette by itself, the colors that they used have all changed. Used in any of these structures till the 16th century. In fact, treatises on painting images of gods and goddesses advises, or in fact, bans the usage of blue. So that's why in ancient paintings, you see even Krishna, who's supposed to be officially painted in blue, they go for what looks like a very dark patch of green. And that looks like blue, but it is not exact blue pigment. So that was a blanket ban on blue being used as a part of the palette. But once you start seeing, I mean, the time when you start seeing blue as such is post-Victorian influence, Portuguese influence. So temples from the recent past, after 20th century, with the influence from other countries, invasions, and other settlers and tradesmen who walked in. I mean, they generally walk in with their culture. I mean, any migration and all that, any travel will have its own impact on the local tradition. And so, material science, engineering principles, elements of design, ornamentation features, spatial planning, activities-based spaces design, all of this had its own impact. From the 20th century, with the advent of steel and cement and glass, artificial lightning and more, and with new schools of thoughts, be it ISKCON, I mean, I'm just spiritual awakening that happened in the last century, and they had their own principles, they had their own formula, the message that they had for themselves, the holy book concept, and all those features that you need for any new religion was there. And so they chose to have their own places of worship too. And they, with going by their principles and etiquettes to be followed, they needed multiplex film screening spaces inside. So in order to screen religious themed films and documentaries. So going for, I mean, it's just time demanding, and with the advent of science and technology, sanctum sanctorums needn't be dark or small it needn't be dark. I mean, they needed a vast amphitheater-like look to accommodate their gods and have maximum scope for gathering. Some of these ISKCONs in India and abroad are really huge to accommodate thousands of people at the same time. And all of them, they ensure that the angle of seating and all that is calculated pretty much like what would you do in the design of a cinema or a amphitheater. So you have seating facilities done, and from whichever corner of the hall that you are, you get to have a very clear glimpse of the god. So with contemporary services happening, air conditioning of worship spaces or room heating that is required, and once you move into other countries, following the local code of conduct and building traditions, I mean, the rules to be followed and all that is a mandate. I mean, hats off to all those early settlers who, especially in the United States, who thought that temples were an integral part of Hindu way of life and fought good for their rights to have their own construction being done. And we have norms in place exclusively: fire safety, heating and ventilation, electrification, lighting safety, and during extreme weather conditions, how exactly do you treat the structure, and all of this. And to this is the do's and don'ts prescribed in the agamas. I mean, I would personally say it's an easy task to buy a piece of land here in India, anywhere in India, get an approval to construct a religious space. But to fight for your rights and get your laws in place, I mean, some of them, and ensure that with minimum compromise, you have our own temples built there everywhere around, is a massive task. And I really bow to the determination and perseverance with which the Indian community is there fought to get their rights.
Please stay tuned. I think we have lost Madhusudhanan ji. I hope he joins quickly. Thank you.
My apologies. My apologies. And so yeah, we were talking about the Hindu temples, Indian temples constructed in the United. Pomano Ranganatha temple, a very extensively constructed Hindu temple dedicated to Sri Vaishnavite cause. The patron of the temple is staunch adherence to Sri Vaishnavite traditions. And as it goes, you have the Sanctum Sanctorum, you have several shrines for the gods and goddesses. One thing that I see very unique in this temple is there is nothing outside the Sri Vaishnavite traditions that's permitted to be practiced here in this temple. It's a challenge by itself, and I think they've done a good job on that. And all rituals or festivals, as it is celebrated in the Indian Vishnu temples here, is all replicated. And I was told that in fact one of the patrons had taken up sannyasa to be a jeer for this temple, and that's a big leap, I would say. And I mean, again, hats off and my sincere prayers at the feet of devotees of this kind. Of course, Pittsburgh, one of those old temples constructed, which is very popular for the prasadam that they keep offering. And the structures have a basement structure or have a ground floor structure, and the temple shrines happen in the first floor. Now, quite a few of my Indian friends here have asked me if that is even permitted. Well, compromises are there in the Sthapatya text. We've been extremely compromising. Because the objective is to enter and all other services associated with it. What if a temple town happens on the hill, on the mountains, or on the valleys, and still you want to have a shrine for a god? You cannot go in search of boulders or quarry near places where you live. So with whatever minimum materials you have, with however humble the structure can be, you can, if a temple structure has to be constructed on the seashore along the coast of South India, such cases, even the direction, while east is the preferred direction to install the gods, you have examples the west. So these are those exceptions that are given. Our treatises are ancient practices, not just with architecture, any kind of sadhana ensures that none of our deficiencies come in way of our sadhana. If you're not able to do something for whatever reasons, health reasons, financial reasons, whatever it is, bare minimum what you can do is also prescribed. And the God is much more than being pleased when you try to do that. Being very committed and doing it wholeheartedly is what is looked upon. We have several episodes from several Puranas and Itihasas and local traditions where devotees who couldn't move a limb have satisfied the gods themselves. People who cannot afford a square meal of food for themselves offered whatever morsel of food they could manage, and that was more than enough for the gods to bless them with moksha. And that's not new to us. So therein, when you have to, with space constraints, accommodating several deities, because each community will have people from different parts of India, different region, different patron gods, different family gods, and all of them would want that one space where at least a little image of their gods are also kept. Cases in such Indian temples there, which is helped in bonding of the community much better. Sometimes you have the same shrine shared with the Jain community also. They are big time patrons and they have requests to accommodate one of their the Tirthankaras, and worship also goes on. Sometimes you have the Shaivite priests who extend their service to Vaishnavite shrines also. Sometimes you have priests who've been hired from Kerala, practitioners of tantric ritual traditions, who offer worship in other deities, shrines, in a way supporting the bond of the community there and build better in a spiritual practice than being strictly attaching yourself only to traditions that you believe in. So having spaces where food is offered to the devada all through the week, all through the year, and spaces where functions can be conducted, spaces where classes can be conducted, because this is that one place which is like from where our temple concept started. I mean, yesterday we were discussing about how the temple has a multi-centric focus. It's where local discussions happen, local gatherings happen. The local community congress was there in the temple to decide on important pressing issues. You had the local sabha functioning from the temple. The sabha elections were conducted in the temples. The local court of law was there. Any function at home, any celebration, personal celebration, family celebration, it was the temple that doubled up as a space. And no wonder you have halls that are rented in most of these Hindu temples where you can conduct your birthday and Aish Homam, Satyabda Purti, 80th anniversary, and Remembrance Day, and rituals, Darpanam, and whatnot. And I was just floored to see some places where they have managed to build a small pond also outside, considering that more like a swimming pool and following the restrictions for a swimming pool. And they've constructed a pond actually, and I've heard stories about how they managed to ship in water from the Ganges and Yamuna, and they've poured it there. The Tirtha, as such, they have Tirthavari festivals, in some cases even a small Utsavam or the float festival being conducted. Reverence, I would say. And so Chicago, the great Chicago Temple, Illinois, the Rama Temple there. I think it's close to half a century old now, and it's one of my personal favorites. That this temple has makes it even more special to me. So with all the constraints in place, trying your best to hold on to your roots and constructing a space where you have room spaces for all your gods and calling that as that one temple to which you are connected. That space which offers you all the facilities that a temple in India would offer. The priest who is so personally connected, the priest who knows us all at a family level, whom we request to come and perform when you have personal and family gatherings at home. So it's the best way to stand connected to your roots. And I'm sure with 3-4 generations, families with 3 or 4 generations living there in the US, you can still feel that connect with the country here. If at all that happens, because of the community building that had happened with the temple as the central point of focus. I would like to summarize today's session. We started with the styles of temple construction from different regions, how evolution had happened from a very humble altar space or a fire sacrifice or a fire ritual space. From there, how we have come up to places where the complete city is a part of the temple, and the temple is nothing but the city together, as in the case of Srirangam or Madurai. Materials, choosing your materials for construction technology, the topography, how an inclined plane, a contoured piece of land, or a land on the seashore, or a temple which is literally on the banks of a river, where the river water actually touches the compound wall. So we have various different topography to choose from, and so our ancestral, traditional system had ensured that the material palette and the structural systems chosen is in concurrence to the topography. Requirements have grown. So what was initially planned as a residence to the Almighty, which was visited once in a while by us, had to evolve into a space that is so personally, emotionally connected to every individual, every family, and the whole community. So multiple spaces inside, performance spaces, gatherings, multi-use spaces, auditorium, hall spaces, kitchens, dining spaces, all of these had to be a part of the temple. And so it evolved to be that one-stop solution for personal community level connection. Temple and society are inseparables. If you try to meddle with it and separate, we are the losers. So try and see to build the community around temples, ensure that the policies that you draft concurs with temple traditions and practices, ensure a regular meet of the community happens in no other place but inside the temple. Have a prayer session as a common feature for all they've been doing, and you know, the community building that happens there, and best wishes to the coming generations. And with that, I conclude the session. Murthy ellam vaali, yengal monaguru vaali, arul vaarthai endrum vaali, anbar vaali parabarame. Ellam Sri Tyagaraja Kripai, Sri Tyagaraja Maharajo Vijayate, Arura Tyagesa, Sri Gurubhyo Namaha, and Namaste once again. All my social media handles are just projected there, and if you have any doubts after the session or comments or suggestions on anything, please feel free to connect with me through my website or my other social media handles. I'll be happy to respond to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madhusudhanan ji. That was a very interesting and informative session. In fact, we enjoyed it very much. There are not very many questions, but let me read out a few questions that I have here. One is, can you throw a little bit of light on the tools that they would have used when they transitioned from non-granite structures to a granite structure? Is it just a chisel and a hammer? Because we see very beautiful circular pillars, which would have required something like a lathe or something like that. Like what kind of tools did they have to be able to construct these structures? I think we lost Madhusudhanan ji. He is reconnecting.
My apologies once again, GM. My connectivity is bad, and I'm back. I'm sorry.
Oh no. Yep.
Yeah, can we get started with the questions?
Yep. Technical glitches are always a problem for us too. So one question was like, what kind of tools did they use when they were constructing granite temples beyond just a chisel and a hammer? Because we see very beautiful circular pillars and stuff like that, which would have, which did we lose Madhusudhanan ji again? Did we lose you?
Yeah. So
yeah.
Talking about the tools, apart from chisel and hammer, there are descriptions of crowbars. There are descriptions of sharp tools that can be used to split the boulders. See, the very idea of splitting a huge boulder into smaller pieces, that by itself is challenging. And they used a very indigenous and a smart system wherein they'll make small holes, say 2 or 3 inch deep holes on a huge boulder that they have chosen to break, and they would peg in neem tree branches in those holes, hammer them deep in, rivet them, and keep pouring water in it. Neem tree swells with more water, and after a point of time there is a crack that develops and it kind of breaks the complete boulder, and that can be chiseled into much smaller pieces. There are still and it is still there for us to see. So that's the tradition that they've used to break the boulders. Apart from that, it's just regular hammer and chisel to cut them into smaller pieces to put them one on top of the other. Concept of pulleys are being described. So to erect a pulley to lift stone blocks to take them all the way up to the vimanas and shikaras should have been there. And elephants should have helped them in the best way to transfer construction materials.
Thank you. What type of temples were built earlier in India in like Ayodhya, Mathura, and other places where we have a record of a temple existing even prior to the structures that we see today?
In the north of India, it was mostly sandstone that was quite extensively used, as opposed to the granite here in south. So, in the archaeological excavation that had happened in Ayodhya, based on which you had the court verdict and other things, also speaks about murtis and bas-relief sculptures, columns, all made out of sandstone that have been discovered. So we are not quite sure about the blueprint, but we have textual references to the shrines which had been visited by saints and saint poets who speak about grand halls and the sanctum sanctorum, where, for example, in Ayodhya, it is said that the little Rama in a cradle was what was the main murti that was worshipped. And so we have such textual references as such. So we can safely assume that those were the temples built out of sandstone and that existed before the
Thank you. Another question, probably the last question today, is like why is artificial lighting generally not allowed inside, like the Garbhagudi and stuff like that in some temples? Do you have some information on that?
HVAC systems going in for artificial lighting to enhance the ambience and to ensure that concentration is much more. I wouldn't say it's wrong, but using that in ancient temples is something that I'm not a big fan of. In fact, it's prohibited by laws here in India now, at least in Tamil Nadu.
Thank you so much for that. That's all I have with the questions. I invite Dr. Sanjay Saxena to conclude today's presentation. On to you, Dr. Saxena.
Thank you so much, Madhusudhanan ji. So I think before I concluded, I think I had some question too. I think it just popped my mind. I was involved with the construction of the Hindu temple here. What was a team of construction team in the olden times, in the ancient time with the temple? What would comprise a construction team? I know the construction team now, when we are building here in America. What was the construction team at that time?
You mean the construction team, as in the workforce?
Like Sthapati and Shilpi, and
so
how many?
Yeah. I mean, we have inscriptional evidences about the workforce that was employed by Rajaraja the Great to construct the big temple in Tanjavur. If that can be safely assumed as a critical sample, we have one chief architect, and he came up with a blueprint. And in fact, yesterday I was telling about how the chief architect's horoscope match with the patron was a mandate. In fact, it was stage one, where before even zeroing down on the architect, the horoscope match with the patron and the architect has this was the planning part of it being done. Apart from that, these architects, some of them were directly involved in actually coming up with the sculptures also. And the workforce or the unskilled labor, we don't have exact statistics about it. So for the big temple, we had one chief architect, 4 senior and 4 junior architects.
Have we found any blueprints of the ancient temples at all? Like what kind of blueprints they used, or was it all in a perishable material, so there's nothing which is surviving?
I'm sorry, my audio is again bad. Can you please repeat the question?
Yeah. So I think, is there any sign of any blueprints left for these temple, like how really they had the process, or they're all perishable? They're made on a perishable material so that we don't have access to any of those things?
By blueprints, there are a few textual references, not exact drawing blueprints kinds. So we have textual references about the measurements to be followed, the materials, seasoning of materials. For example, lime plaster was the binding material that was quite extensively used. And the whole recipe to prepare the lime plaster, the number of days that it has got to be left to ferment, in fact, a planning for the lime yard as such, because it's going to be extensively used. So coming up with a lime yard design with where you will have to enter it, where what has got to happen, where the grinding equipment should be, where the sieving should happen, all of that is still available. So thankfully that's still being practiced also, and we've just revived it. So these are those little descriptions that we have on setting up of the workspace and the blueprints as such.
And my last question is that for the Ellora temple, is there been a research conducted that how in the present days also we can construct a temple like that? How could they could have imagined something like constructing from top bottom out of a stone? How would they
Imagination has no
plan it?
boundaries, and with the available power that they had in hand and the workforce that was in place, and patronage was just unlimited, so it's only quite natural that they could come up with these structures. All that we have as constraints today, it was available in abundance to them. So it was on the profit side for them with free of cost workforce and unskilled labor. I mean, you could just have them all everywhere around, and finance was never an issue. So they could always decide and come up with such structures.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madhusudhanan ji. And on behalf of Hindu Temple, I want to really thank you for your time, your well-researched presentations, very interesting history of architecture of Hindu Temple, as well as giving a tour of so many temples. I mean, I have not visited, I visited South when I was very, very young, I guess, just a few years old, I guess, so I don't remember much of it. But I think I'll make a point of taking a tour again. So, but very interesting, and thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We can conclude it now. Arvind?
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thanks.
Gauriji, is our broadcasting stopped?